Hi everyone. I understand legal might not be very exciting at this time of the day when you've got cocktails outside, but anyone who's interested, you might have something to learn. Don't all of us as startup founders need some legal advice? You're getting free today. Okay, so I think without any further ado and without trying to sound very boring, we'll start this panel. And to be honest, I'm not a legal expert. I'm actually speaking purely from a startup perspective, and I'm sure all of you understand on a daily basis, all of us are facing issues, living them. I actually joke about this with my lawyers, reading legal agreements, contracts all the time. I've probably become a sue lawyer, even if that's something as a thing. So I think we've got quite a diverse panel here. Each one of them, I don't think you guys need an introduction. But what I'm going to try to do is really cover some basics about what we are facing in the world today under legalities, and also on a day-to-day basis, what are startups really facing under the legal regime. I think most of the people here are very well versed in how things are, but nonetheless, so I think I will start with you, Abdullah. What's really happening right now, we see there's a free fall in startup valuations happening. There's investor confidence has gone down. In addition to that, I think one thing that's really happened over the recent past is that I think investors have become a little more wary and with information, and they have access to more information as opposed to what they might have had a year back. Even now they're trying to get out of high barrier to entry markets. So with such a market, where you've got downfall in valuations, you've got a macroeconomic situation where, the inflation is high, currency devaluations, are a norm. What kind of implications do you think, this environment is going to have on deal terms today? And, a second part of that question would be, how should investors, as well as startup founders, be looking at this environment when they're structuring deal terms?
Thanks, Naureen, and thanks everybody for being here. So there's a lot of questions rolled into that. Look, I mean, the current environment, which since around, I would say, the summer of last year, has been getting more and more hesitant and reticent in terms of deal closing, is definitely impacting what's happening in venture deals. The number of later stage, growth stage deals post Series A has dropped off pretty significantly, and that's happened all over the world. Series A transactions are still getting done, but they're getting done, slightly more slowly and with certain features that you didn't used to see before. I think one of the most common things that we're seeing is companies positioning equity rounds as convertible rounds. There's a lot of that going on because people don't want to have a valuation discussion today and they want to kick that can down the road. And that's driven by the kind of the nervousness in the minds of not just GPs but LPs as well. And in those convertible rounds, we're also seeing things like, warranties and due diligence being undertaken that isn't particularly undertaken in early stage deals. In price deals, whether it's Series A or the slightly rarer growth stage deals, you're seeing things creeping into deal terms like liquidation preferences, either being participating or multiples of liquidation preferences or more aggressive approaches to anti-dilution. And the reason for that is that companies that raised funds in 2021 at valuations that nobody is going to give today are potentially getting to a point where they're running out of money. They're not able to get the same kind of valuation that they would have done in the previous market. And so VCs are being a little bit creative and founders are being a little bit creative around how do they kind of get an up round on paper that is probably going to be a little bit more problematic and is going to give them a headache down the road because they're agreeing to 2 or 3 times participating liquidation preference when, the market norm is for a one-time non-participating, for example. From my perspective, I'm also an investor as the founder and chairman of Dubai Angel Investors. We have a 38 portfolio company early stage fund and have been investing that, globally in the US, Europe, and the Middle East, as well as my day job being a venture and tech transactions lawyer. I think the most interesting feature about today's market is that 2023 is probably going to be a great year of opportunity. In the deal flow that I see both in my day job and as an investor, there are lots of really interesting special opportunities at the moment. Again, companies that are maybe in a slightly sort of stressed situation and being able to participate in discounted deals, there's going to be quite a lot of that. But I think if you're an investor in today's market, or if you're a founder in today's market, probably the most important thing to do to survive the market as it currently is have a look around your investor table, have a look on your cap table and your board, and make sure that you have a functioning board that can help you if you reach a moment of crisis, because a lot of companies have either reached that moment or are going to reach that moment in the next 8 to 12 months. And if you're somebody whose runway is 6 to 12 months out, then you should make sure you have a very functional board with preferably a grey-haired, experienced problem solver who's been through a recessionary environment before, that can help you problem solve, manage stakeholders, and get solutions to problems when they present themselves. If you're not prepared now, you may end up as a casualty of the current environment.
Well, yeah, well said. And I think we, as having run 2 startups, really felt the need for both, one definitely on the governance side, but also on the legal side, There's so much, we've been bothering Mubariz a lot with a lot of things that happen, on our end. But, I'll try to shift the focus more so from a global perspective to what's really bridging the local and the global divide. We've seen over-regulation, particularly talking about Pakistan, has driven many startups, well, actually almost all startups, to domicile their companies in, friendly jurisdictions. Well, probably I think Tej was, one of the only startups that actually domiciled in Pakistan. I think that was a huge mistake now that, I look back in retrospect. We had to issue preference shares to, our foreign investors. Oh my! And it was such an issue because in Pakistan, Mubariz would know better. There's a different class of preference shares of how it's issued. When we had to digitally register the shares, it actually took us around a year to get that done because the notarizations and the attestations that had to be done from the Pakistan embassies, abroad, it was such a painful process. And the other issue was auditors also become lawyers. So I've actually faced KPMG, I'm sorry for naming, I shouldn't have done that. But we've actually really faced a lot of challenges from auditors themselves. I remember I literally had to go back, because KPMG had an issue with one of the way the preference shares were defined in our SHA. We had to go back to our shareholders to change the definition of the term to actually bring it in compliance with the law. So, there's so many other issues that happen with overregulation. To you, Hasan, my question would be, what do you think should be the next steps? Or, how can we actually counter this issue of overregulation, particularly when it comes to domiciling companies, outside of Pakistan and other friendly jurisdictions?
Thank you, Naureen. Yes, so what I understand also in Pakistan, for instance, there are separate different regulators such as the State Bank of Pakistan and the SECB, plus the tax authorities. And even on a basic level, as definition of a startup company, there are differences, which creates ambiguity for the founders and for the shareholders and the investors as well. From a very practical perspective, firstly, there has to be synchronization between the regulators. Like for instance, from experience in the Middle East, for instance, the regulators also provide some sort of a guidance when there is ambiguity in the written down regulations. So I don't know whether that is still there in Pakistan. If not, then that has to be developed in the regulatory system. Because even from our perspective, if you go to different lawyers, and as you said, sometimes accountants or other advisors become lawyers as well, you can get different interpretation of written down laws. So there has to be some clarity in the regulatory framework in Pakistan. But from a corporate structuring perspective, like for instance, the State Bank in Pakistan has recently allowed formation of holding companies outside Pakistan for the founders. So the holding company and operating company structure, the holding company in a favorable jurisdiction such as the UAE or Singapore, and the operating companies in Pakistan may work as well, because the founders and the shareholders can take advantage of the regulatory incentives and the tax incentives that have been provided. For instance, in the UAE, both the DIFC and ADGM are very well structured regulatory jurisdictions. Both are based on common law framework, and they have their own common law based court system as well. That is a very attractive proposition for international and regional investors. For Pakistan, Singapore has been historically also a very popular jurisdiction, and some of the major VC firms and accelerators have Singapore as their preferred jurisdiction. So the founders and the shareholders in Pakistan should definitely look at the holding company and operating company structure. Plus, there has to be clarity in the local regulatory framework. From a tax perspective also, if the biggest impediment, as was previously discussed in the other panels, is the exits. And exits can be structured from a tax efficiency point of view to, if not to avoid, to minimize tax incidence. And that's, if you have a holding company, for instance, in the DIFC, there's no capital gain tax over here. That's one of the biggest impediments for founders and investors. So we can go on this topic, which may go into legal advice also, which I don't want to provide at this stage. but those are the main elements.
And thank you. You touched upon taxes, because I was actually going to come to Taimur on that. It's interesting, and God, taxes is quite. It's a very slippery slope. And this actually takes me back to one incident that happened with us. So we won this award. It was a visa award that we won in Paris. It was $100,000. And when the money came in to Pakistan, we were actually charged a 30% corporate tax on the prize money. Now imagine that, man. So I was like literally heartbroken. I was like, "Itni mehnat, we're working so hard, and for nothing, these guys are actually taking away the money." So, since then, taxes has really, I don't really go well with taxes. I file all of them. I pay all my taxes. But, this was an area that always bothered us. Now, what happens is, and you're well aware, taxes hit startups at various levels. And you pointed out a very important point. There's no coherence in how you actually define a startup as well. Under tax law, the definition of a startup is different from that under the company's law. So those dichotomies create a lot of challenges within startups as well. You've got your minimum tax, you've got a bottom line tax, you've got your capital gains tax. So for all of our startups, one thing that we really want to know is, how do you actually achieve tax efficiencies? And if you're not, if there's no circumvention around it, how would you propose we actually talk to the regulators or the authorities to achieve that?
Thank you. I think I agree with everything that's been said so far. I would say that wherever there is a problem, there's normally a lawyer. But also wherever there is a solution, there is also a lawyer there. And that is especially true when we talk about tax issues. And it's not an issue that's specific to Pakistan. I think anywhere we look, and in the future, I guess Abdullah would agree, even here, tax issues are going to become important and something that needs to be considered very carefully. What I have seen in relation to Pakistani startups compared to startups elsewhere that I've been involved with, that Pakistani startups, one, till recently didn't used to take much legal advice, let alone tax advice. So in Pakistan, apart from the taxation regimes that you mentioned, there are also the local sales taxes. So there is a Punjab Revenue Authority, there is a Sindh Revenue Board, and so on. And in one case, a startup which was doing reasonably well somehow realize that they have never registered with the local revenue authority and had not been paying sales tax. And it was a big problem for them. But we should also consider that the companies of one of the panelists who spoke earlier received a heavy tax bill in Saudi recently. So these issues around interpretation of what tax is payable and under what head, how you can achieve tax efficiency, these are relevant for startups everywhere. A lot of the North American technology companies are structured out of Ireland for a reason, or in South America, that's for tax efficiency reasons. I would say that the first thing is, once you are getting your startup off the ground, make sure you have proper legal and tax advice, so you structure it properly, and there are no unforeseen issues, later on. And secondly, create proper corporate structures. So if Pakistan is a complicated tax jurisdiction, maybe you only need to have an opco there. Your holdco from the word go, as you experienced in your case. And I remember maybe 6 odd years ago, I was your foreign investors lawyer. Those challenges are there. So I would say structure it right, get proper advice, and not necessarily from a lawyer. Lawyers are generally good at tax litigation. I think, if I can say this, but the audit firms normally have better tax structuring advisors. So I'm taking some work away from myself and my colleagues here, but that's where you go for that. If you want to challenge a tax bill or want an interpretation that suits you, then go to a lawyer and not to an audit firm. So this is what I would say.
Thank you. We actually, on one side, as we have KPMG as an auditor, which is quite tough, we also have KPMG as our tax advisors, which is still better. Oh, no wonder. So, this is very interesting. Now, all of that taken, Mubariz, you've been, the name in the startup law space ever since startups was a thing in Pakistan. I remember my first interaction with you with Sarmayakar when you were representing them. And, there's so much that you've seen in the Pakistan ecosystem. But one thing, that, despite whatever's going on in Pakistan, and there's a lot of activity that's been happening on the startup space, there's no coherent, policy framework for startups as yet. We see, policy frameworks happening in India, Singapore, many other startup-friendly zones, but Pakistan is yet to have one. And, we see many times regulators are, it's more of a firefighting approach that they adopt, whenever there's a problem. They try to address that just to bring in incentives or, the way forward. But for any investor that's coming out of Pakistan or to Pakistan, they need a clear policy to know how will they actually earn on their return when they're investing. I know this is not an easy question, and there's so many parts to it. But what would you recommend, are the requirements to have a policy framework in Pakistan for startups?
Sure, thanks, Naureen. So what Pakistan generally lacks is coherence in policy across the board, right? Or long-term policy across the board. That is something that is not just limited to the startup sector, that's in many different industries. But if I were to propose a coherent long-term policy, I think what does not happen is multiple regulators working together with common objectives. So to give you an example, if a small business, which is not even an incorporated entity, wants to register for tax in Pakistan, we have very low tax collections, as most people know, you have to provide an office address. And not only do you have to provide an office address, you have to provide a proof that you actually are renting that office space, which requires either a rent agreement. So the concept of people working from home is lost on the tax collector over there. It just causes additional friction. It fails to recognize how the trend that is prevailing in the world now, right? But what is changing now is that some regulators do recognize that the new kind of businesses or the new entrepreneurs want to approach things differently. So to just give you an example, SECP, the number of incorporated entities in Pakistan till 5 years ago was around 60 to 70,000, somewhere in that region. Over the last 5 years, it's now risen to 185,000. So what the trend, and it's like around 2,000 to 2,500 per month. The trend we're seeing now is that the new age entrepreneurs, they want a documented business. They want to do things properly. What is difficult though is that in Pakistan, just like many other emerging markets, it's still harder to do a documented business than an undocumented one. Now, so any policy in that regard would have to be coherent across the board, where your tax collector FBR, your company's regulator SECP, and state bank, along with say the Trademark Registration Authority, Intellectual Property Organization, they'd all have to come together, and they'd all have to really truly understand this one key concept, that you do not have to create friction when getting people to just start, right? You can always ask for more information later. You can always ask for more documentation later. Just make it easy for people to start, and then everything else will fall into place. So it's just this simple mindset around how the global business is changing, how the entrepreneur in Pakistan is changing, and how you just need to remove friction from the beginning, and you can maybe add it later when people are either funded or they have big enough teams to handle those things.
Is there anything happening right now with the regulators? Any conversations going on?
So some regulators are quite active, right? So State Bank of Pakistan has quite actively, so the holding company law that they introduced 2 years ago, SECP has changed laws around preference shares. Now they're much easier to issue in Pakistan. ESOPs, which were not a thing before, was only for public companies, is now also allowed for private companies. Some regulators have really made a lot of effort and actually brought about meaningful regulatory reform, and that too in a very short span of time. I was speaking to Rahat from Anchorlist, but Bangladesh still is battling with the holding company regulation, right? They still have not officially allowed it, and they still don't understand why. And it's not just because Pakistan, say, has a particular legal impediments. It's more of a commercial decision. If I'm making an investment decision sitting in a global firm to directly buy securities in a Pakistani company, I need to do due diligence on the whole country. Now that's a 6-month exercise. I need to get tax advice, I get legal advice, I need to understand the whole thing. Whereas I've invested 50 times in Singapore before, and it's a 1-week decision process. So it's more about that as opposed to Pakistan being in particularly difficult jurisdiction, which we're not actually. Especially for venture, when the ease of doing business ranking was still alive, Pakistan ranked, I think it was number 30 for minority protection. Which is phenomenal in terms of overall, and even in ease of doing business, it's not so bad. With regards to foreign investment, we have you can have 100% foreign-owned company. Repatriation, at least the policy is easy, but if there's practical issues, that's a different thing. So yeah, those things are there, but it's just from a practical perspective, holding company makes more sense in a lot of things.
Great, thank you. I don't want to. I hope legal is not boring for most people here. Full respect to all of you, but let's try to make it a little more interesting. And you guys are living this every day. So each one of you, what is the biggest challenge you think startups are facing right now? One challenge, and what would your recommendation be to rectify that challenge? Each one of you should have a different answer.
So I don't think that this is particular to Pakistani startups, but the biggest challenge, for instance, in my experience advising startups, is a very basic level. It is opening a bank account. Opening a bank account, even here in the UAE, which is a very streamlined jurisdiction, everything is very fast-tracked. It takes a considerable number of time, and that creates impediments in the overall business plan. So I think there have been steps taken to digitize and automate the process, the compliance process, the KYC process. I think this will be more enhanced in a country like Pakistan, where it's still the digital process is not that much implemented. That's on a practical level. Specifically for Pakistani startups, I think as Mubariz also mentioned, the mindset of thinking out of the box, thinking from the perspective of their potential investors, which may entail costs as well, extra costs, which again creates an impediment for startups to think about going in a foreign jurisdiction and unknown territory for them to incorporate a company. I think those are some of the practical challenges that are faced.
Going one by one. Yeah. For me, I think I have more experience in Pakistan, but for even emerging markets, I think access to different forms of capital is still probably the biggest issue. While you have venture capital available in abundance, which of course solves for a different type of problem, you don't have small cap private equity available. So the example that I was giving earlier was if you run a juice bar, you have $0 available, but if you run an app where you can order juices from, you have like millions of dollars available. I think that is again that comes down to there's a regulatory and policy issue behind that. The regulatory issue being, again, most of these businesses that fall within the private equity spectrum have existed over some time and are, say, run on cash or have a lot of undocumented sales, etc., attached to them. That again is because it's harder to run a documented business, start a documented business in emerging markets or in most emerging economies such as Pakistan, which leads to these businesses accessing informal capital, which keeps their business informal throughout. And that's why it's just a vicious cycle where none of these great businesses, great entrepreneurs, with good cash flows, they do not have access to any institutional form of capital. And that's why that institutional form of capital also does not exist because they don't have enough businesses with clean books.
Mubariz, do you think that's more of a commercial issue than a legal issue?
Both. Like I said, like it's just a lack of documentation, and it's harder being like. So, for example, in Pakistan, your digital transactions have a tax on it, right? If you want to do a cash-based transaction, if you want to do it through checks, there's no fee on it. So it's
is a little different.
Punjab, yeah, exactly. But again, Karachi has Sindh and Karachi have a big chunk of activity there. So point being, the incentives are against having a documented business running. It's easier to do an undocumented one, and it's easier to actually attract capital if you're doing an undocumented one.
Before we come to you, Taimur, I think one issue that we've actually seen, at least I've observed it, is that many bankers actually, unfortunately, the regulations, the prudential regulation that they follow, I think that there's a very, there's a myopic view of how those regulations are really interpreted. So mostly the compliance departments of banks actually end up to be the gatekeepers to those funds. And well, I feel one thing that definitely should be done is actually have, proper, maybe trainings for compliance departments, because they really end up being gatekeepers for between those funds and ultimately.
State Bank actually needs to, or regulators need to actually regulate banks for better user experience. There should be a fine if an account is taking more than 30 days to open, for example. They don't do it for user experience. They do it for it's all about protecting against a big downside, which rarely happens. But banks sitting on a lot of delaying things and actually businesses losing out, that's just not penalized at all.
Thank you.
Excellent points made by my colleagues. I agree with everything that's been said. I would highlight a commercial/legal issue and challenge. And I would say, and it's not again specific to Pakistan, but perhaps more to emerging markets generally, is that the challenge that's faced by startups in validating their revenue streams or customer base for incoming investors and for valuation purposes. I think that's a challenge that maybe we don't talk about often, but it is the elephant in the room a lot of the times when serious VC money is at play. So, and the solution to that, and I think the problem also around it, is the lack of a ready DD book, which you would see in some more developed economies that startups would have. And it comes back to the lack of proper legal and tax advice from the beginning. So startups, especially which are customer or intensive, need to make sure that before they grow too big, they have a system in place whereby incoming investors can really validate their user base, the customer base, and revenue streams. I think they'll just make life so much easier for them when they do fundraising, and also for investors investing in them. So that's what I would say is a key point, which I think.
Interesting. So that actually expands us to another, complete area of sharing our data or our numbers publicly. Hopefully someone would actually come up with that repository. But yeah, I think it's also governance at the end of the day, right?
Yeah,
so yeah, that's interesting, but difficult. Startups are never willing to share the information. But that's really interesting. Abdullah, what about you?
Thanks, Taimur. And by the way, there was the example just last week of the founder in the US who had sold her company to JP Morgan and made up 4 million fake users in an Excel sheet in a data room. So anyway, yeah, so these things happen, but I do agree with all of the comments that have been made. Look, I think the question is, what is the biggest challenge for startups today? I have I hope an interesting take on this. But before I insult everyone in the room, how many people sitting here are VCs or private equity? Just 2 or 3? Okay, good. So I won't be insulting too many of you. No, I mean, joking aside, I think one of the biggest challenges facing entrepreneurs and startups today is access to smart capital. And when I say smart capital, I don't mean that everybody's stupid. I mean, venture capital should be about putting, wind behind the sails of entrepreneurs. Not about getting a smart deal like in private equity where you're supposed to buy low, sell high, turn around, create value and then exit. Of course, as a VC, that's what your LPs expect of you. They expect you to invest, create value, and find an exit somehow on a probably longer hold period. But the thing that I find, and this affects, I think, our region more than I see, for example, on the US deals or the European deals I work on, particularly the US deals where the venture capital kind of calibration, the mindset is quite different, is that here our investors are too focused on, am I going to get the right deal? Am I going to get my exit? And they're not really thinking about creating value for the entrepreneur. And so I think the biggest challenge for entrepreneurs these days in our region and emerging markets generally is that there's actually an abundance of dry powder. There's never been this much dry powder ever available for early stage companies. The problem with dry powder is that in the wrong hands, it can create craziness around valuations. And 2020 and 2021, of course, this was a global phenomenon, but in our region, we were not immune to it. There was a whole craziness around valuations, which is problematic, by the way. And so again, whether I'm a mentor, a lawyer, or an investor, whenever a founder comes to me and says, here's my MVP, I've just built it, and this investor over here is offering me a $35 million pre-money valuation, I say to them, if you want to take it, but this is going to cause you a massive problem down the line. Think about what you're doing. Does this investor have the ability and the network and the capacity and the knowledge and the expertise to create value for you? Or are they just offering you a high valuation? Because if it's the latter, you're going to enjoy a few parties with your friends, but in 2 years from now, you're going to have a major problem. And so I think that's the biggest challenge for founders these days. I mean, this kind of first half of 2023 is challenging. Last half of 2022 was challenging. But when we get back to a confident market, which is going to happen, especially in our region, because we don't have the inflationary interest rates, supply chain, energy crisis issues that is happening everywhere else. We're actually in a completely counter-cyclical market. So investor confidence should return in this region super fast, with good reason. But then for the founders, really make sure that you're taking money from people that are going to add value to your business. And that should be your first priority. And that's the biggest challenge.
Abdullah, that was actually a key point that you actually raised. We've seen the VC model as we know it today, without any offense to all the VCs here. they've always bet on a small number of big deals, at the cost of maybe a larger number of abject failures. Do you think this model, whatever's happening around right now, does this model have to change now, or the way VCs are looking at it, is this just another cycle like investment banking used to go through? You guys, any one of you who's actually advising VCs, what are you guys advising them now, and what is their remark to this? Anyone can
I mean, I'll take it quickly and then because I want to hear what everybody else has to say on this. When I'm advising VCs today, my main advice to them, sort of the strategic advice is, create value. Be the problem solver. Don't be the smart guy, right? If you're the smart guy, you might end up with a great deal, but people are going to remember that when the market recovers and when you've screwed people over. And so what I'm saying to VCs in particular is, in all of these scenarios, because if you've got a mature portfolio, you're going to have access to pro rata rights and potential deal flow, in a pipeline. But you're also going to have problems in your portfolio. Be the problem solver. Be the big person in the room that has the answers to the difficult questions, that can build consensus around a board table, because that's really what is going to, what's going to elevate you to the status of legendary investor that people want to come back to and take money from in the future.
And what's the response usually?
The smart ones completely agree. And I only want to work with those ones. So anyone who says, no, get me a 3 times liquidation preference, usually I prefer to work with the company.
So the best career advice I got was from my first boss, who said that if you build a reputation of being reasonable throughout, it'll help you in negotiations throughout your career. And I've tried to at least stick to that as much as I can. My general advice has been around, like Abdullah just said, you don't have to ask for a 3x liquidation preference. You don't want to be that person, because that'll be shot down anyway. And that's just not going to bode well, because every time you take deals, they will be negotiated very hard, because you'll have that reputation of someone who does not come up with a fair deal. Other than that, I think currently after 2021, whatever the frenzy that was, we're seeing a lot more shift towards governance, right? I think even the sensible ones in 2021 just felt bullied into not insisting on governance, which I thought was fairly unfair, because they were standing to lose on pretty good deals, because they were the ones who seemed unreasonable, asking for very basic diligence at that stage, just because the frenzy was so much, where people were writing checks without having seen much. I think now, at least we're back to the common sense prevailing bit, where founders also need to understand that governance is great for them as well. It keeps them honest, it keeps them in check. It makes sure that the institution that you're trying to build, without which no one gets that outcome that they're looking for, is actually possible. So yeah, my advice now is just insist on governance, because it's good for both. It's not just for you, it's also good for the company that you're investing in.
And it really helps you raise money in the future.
Exactly, yeah.
And if I can add, I always insist, as some of the VCs here know, that please do some due diligence on the startups. We've seen, to Mubariz's point, people, and with good intentions, just going in and writing checks without proper due diligence. Also because many of the Pakistani startups in the past have not been due diligence ready. So, I mean, look, you don't expect a PE investor to put in $10 million without doing a proper due diligence. So why should you expect a VC investor to put in $10 million without due diligence? It's not free money, right? So I think data sharing, to your earlier point, is important, but in a controlled, confidential manner, of course. So due diligence it should be the key word in 2023.
Just to add a couple of points on the thought occurred to me was that in due diligence there are lots of disclosures made and sometimes for some emerging companies there's not that much data, or even if there is data, again going back to the mindset of the founders in a country like Pakistan, there's no data protection law. There are some data protection regulations, I understand, but the concept of data protection and data privacy is not that much applied. So there has to be a sort of an educational process also for the startup community on the importance of these sort of issues. And from a regulatory standpoint as well, the regulators should look at these ancillary areas which will promote more investors looking at Pakistan.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to seal this very interesting, for a change, legal discussion with one piece of advice that you want to give to startup founders during this time.
So how many founders in the room? Excellent. Okay, so I do have this is a piece of legal advice, free legal advice. When you're negotiating a shareholders agreement in a priced round, and your incoming VC investor or investors, or maybe you're a Series B company and you're about to have 1A and 2Bs sitting on your board, make sure that you cannot be forced into an exit without your own consent. So when the board reserved matters are being negotiated or the shareholder reserved matters are being negotiated and a liquidity event is part of that, number one, make sure it's a board reserved and not a shareholder reserved. And make sure that the majority requires your vote. At least if there are two co-founders, one of your votes. And the reason for that is that, and I'm seeing it a lot in today's market, and I have a client right now who's going through an exit process. I negotiated his Series C shareholders agreement. So it's a fairly mature stage company, large revenue, large valuation. They're in the process of a very nice exit at the moment, which hopefully we'll announce in 3 or 4 weeks from now. But we made sure that his vote, his affirmative vote, was required in any liquidity event. And the reason that has ended up being so incredibly positive for him is because when the investor or the buyer, it's a strategic from outside the region, wanted to come and acquire the business, they made an offer that looked good to the preferred shareholders, but not so good to the founder. And this is your business. This is the business that you're building. It's your idea. It's your tech. It's your team. It's your passion. It's your risk, God damn it. Yeah, the VC investors put money with you. But, they're in the business of taking that kind of risk. But this is your life. And so make sure that you're not cut out of the decision-making on a liquidity event so that nobody can force you into a drag situation or force you to accept a share deal when they're getting a cash deal, or an earn-out that doesn't look good for you and doesn't allow you to take money off the table. So that's a real piece of legal advice for any founder in the room.
Excellent advice. I would just add that, negotiate and sign a founders agreement or a shareholders agreement between the co-founders from the word go. Don't wait till you're revenue positive or you have a seed round or something coming up, because by then your own goalpost between co-founders, etc., would have changed, would have moved for sure. And your first disputes, even if they're just in your mind, would appear between the co-founders. So, and again, this is based on experience, not just in Pakistan, but regionally. We've seen this. It's a cultural issue. You would traditionally not see it this much in Western countries, but we tend to see it very often here. So that would be my advice. Start with signing a proper negotiated agreement between yourselves.
I was going to say the exact same thing. So yeah.
One of the biggest reasons of startup failure is actually
co-founder disputes. Yeah, that's exactly what I've seen as well. And I think more than just to build on what Taimur just said, more than just an agreement, work on the relationship. Because it's, most of you are not going to go to court because your company may not be big enough or the stakes may not be high enough for you to go to court. But working on the relationship is more important because your odds of success drastically increase. Other than that, I think in terms of, say, early stage founders, and given what the market is, understand how dilution works. A lot of people just sign loads of safes with different caps and discounts and don't know the cap and discount calculation. Just do your pro forma cap table every single time you raise. Make sure you see exactly what the dilution impact is, and so that there's no surprises at the end, especially in a market like this where there are down rounds and lower caps happening. Just make sure you have a better sense of where your cap table stands.
Thank you. Well, I think I'll just agree with the excellent advice given and a couple of summary points. The first being actually understand the obligations. Whatever you're signing, the founders agreement or other forms of documentation, understand if you're not clear, seek good legal advice. Don't see your legal advisors or financial advisors or technical advisors as being impediments, see them as enablers, see them as your business partners, involve them from the first step. Protect your intellectual property, enter into a good documentation for protection of your the actual underlying asset that you've created, which is your IP. Keep your house in order, meaning like what Mubariz mentioned, the cap table is important, plus the other documentation. Sometimes and mostly it sort of is pushed to the side when the business operations get going. But from an investor's point of view, if the admin and the house keeping stuff is in order, that makes life simpler for them. So think of if you're raising investment, think from the perspective of the investors as well. So those are the 3 or 4 points that founders should follow.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. They were like key points. I hope startup founders took a note of that. Free legal advice. Well, I'll open it up to, if there are any questions, I'll open it up to you. Okay. Let's. Okay, please.
We're billing now.
Okay. So your advice about the holdco and the opco, I mean, I think that's pretty good. Question related to that, how would you advise around stock options if you have a Pakistan-based company? And how would you, what would be the best mode in your view for that setup?
So if you have a holding company, obviously the stock options would have to exist in the holding company. I mean, don't do different cap tables on both ends, because that's really an unclean structure most investors would not appreciate. Most of the funded startups in Pakistan have holding companies, typically Singapore, Delaware. You have to set them up over there. So it's really, and these jurisdictions have very established laws and regulation around ESOP cap options. So yeah.
We would hope that one day we'll have holdcos in Pakistan for the region, but we have still some distance to go.
Regarding the holdco versus opco maybe, and the legal side of it, I wanted to ask this question to the VCs, but I thought there would be more legal side associated to that question. Maybe you would be the best panel. So this is understandable that with the new holdco structure for international investors, it would be much more easier to invest into those companies. But the VCs who actually get the investments from abroad in order to, because they would be doing due diligence in Pakistani companies. So at the same time, we see that most of the success stories of Pakistani VCs would be holdcos. The companies would be registered in Delaware, Singapore, elsewhere. So they actually, FDI is not coming in the name of Pakistan, but in the name of other countries maybe. The flow of money may come in. So what's the legal issue behind it? Why is that so?
If I can take this, I mean, look, that's a major issue. That's a policy issue which any government in Pakistan, this one or the new one, has to tackle. At the moment, the VCs are also not structured in Pakistan, right? Maybe with an exception, they're also abroad. So really, the money is all moving abroad between companies and VCs and back to VCs. So again, goes back to the point that we were making, that hopefully eventually holdcos will be in Pakistan, and therefore VCs will also be in Pakistan. But the issue relates to foreign exchange, currency control, relates to taxation. You don't want to be gifted $100,000 and to have pay 30% tax on it. I mean, if VC money is seen differently and is taxed in Pakistan and returns are taxed, I mean, forget about any decent returns. So I think there's a lot that needs to go around it, but maybe Mubariz can add as well.
Yeah, of course. Ideally, all foreign investment should come directly into a Pakistani company. But even with holdcos, what's happening is the money is still being deployed with the holdco with the intention and the legal obligation to spend it in Pakistan. So it does come to Pakistan. The biggest regulatory challenge is that Pakistani companies cannot open bank accounts and keep US dollars. With the deval, most companies have been very conservative with bringing dollars into Pakistan because there's still no fixed rate. But once we see that settling, I think more capital will come in more often, especially the ones that's parked at the holdco. But another thing that State Bank, the part of the regulation and the requirement is that whenever capital gains are made by the Pakistani resident founders and Pakistani resident investors, capital gains or dividends, they have to be brought into Pakistan. So eventually, it all is supposed to come into Pakistan, flow into Pakistan. But you're right, it's not direct FDI in Pakistan immediately. But if you look at India, a lot of the capital deployed in India is through holding companies as well. A lot of capital deployed in Vietnam is through holding companies as well. It's one of the big issues globally about international tax havens, which have been used to structure investments and all. Like Apple has billions of dollars stashed in Ireland as well. So this is a reality that I think most countries grapple with as well.
And I won't comment about Pakistani founders, but Indian founders in many cases become tax residents in Dubai when they are to receive their exits. So, but hopefully that won't be the case with Pakistan when we see the large exits.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was very insightful. And yeah, we'll continue. I'll try to take some free advice from you again. Thank you, guys.